He stood at his own company banquet bragging to his VP about how he'd finally cut loose dead weight. He was talking about me. I was standing 6 feet away on the arm of his regional director's son, and I'd been dating that man for 3 weeks. The funny part? He didn't even recognize me at first. That's what happens when you spend 2 years looking right through someone. If you're watching this video, tell me where you're from or what time it is for you. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this story. I was not a woman who needed saving. I was not a woman sitting around waiting for some man to tell her she was worth something. I want that on the record right up front. My name is Evelyn, and at 32, I had built something I was genuinely proud of. I worked as a freelance UX and web developer out of the converted garage attached to my rental house in Clarkston. I'd spent about $4,000 turning that garage into the kind of workspace that made me want to get out of bed in the morning. A long white desk along the entire back wall, 2 monitors side by side, a pegboard covered in sticky notes and printed wireframes and reference cards I'd made myself, a small leather couch along the side wall for when I needed to step back and look at something with fresh eyes, a Keurig on a filing cabinet in the corner that I used way more than was probably healthy. The whole place smelled like coffee and the lavender candle I kept burning near the door. My work was good. I mean that without any ego attached to it. It was just a fact I'd come to accept about myself the way you accept that you're bad at parallel parking or good at remembering song lyrics. I built websites and digital experiences for clients who ranged from local nonprofits to mid-size e-commerce brands, trying to look like they had 5 times the budget they actually had. I was good at making things feel intuitive, good at understanding what a user needed before the user even knew they needed it. My clients stayed with me. They sent referrals. They left reviews that made me a little embarrassed to read in public. I had a routine I liked. Up by 7. Coffee made by 7:10. In the garage by 7:30. I'd work through the morning, take a real lunch break away from my desk, something I'd force myself to start doing after I realized I'd eaten standing up for 6 days in a row, then go back in for the afternoon. I did yoga on Tuesday and Thursday evenings at a studio 3 blocks from my house. I had dinner with my friend Sylvia every other Friday. I called my mom on Sunday mornings. I was, by every reasonable measure, doing fine. I'd been in relationships before Maxwell, a couple that lasted a couple of years. One that lasted 4 months and felt like 4 years. None of them had made me feel like I needed to make myself smaller. None of them had made me feel like my career was a phase I'd eventually grow out of. That was a new experience, and by the time I recognized it for what it was, it had already done some damage. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up and tell you about the night I met Maxwell Harding, because nothing about what happened later makes sense unless you understand how good he was at the beginning. It was a Thursday in late September, one of those evenings where the air had finally turned cool enough to wear a jacket, but you still didn't need a scarf. My friend Claudette had been hosting a monthly trivia night at her apartment for about 2 years, and I'd been coming since the beginning. 8 to 12 people around her dining room table, teams of 2 or 3, handwritten score sheets, a prize that was usually a bottle of wine or a gift card to the Thai place 2 blocks over. Maxwell showed up that night as a guest of Claudette's neighbor, a guy named Bryce who I'd met twice and forgotten twice. Maxwell was the kind of person who filled a room without seeming to try. Not loud, not showy, just present. He was wearing dark jeans and a charcoal sweater that looked expensive, in the way that quietly expensive things do, and he had this way of listening when someone talked to him that made you feel like you were the most interesting person he'd encountered in a while. He ended up on my team by default because Claudette had miscounted and there was an odd number of people. He pulled out the chair next to mine, smiled in a way that had just enough self-awareness in it to seem genuine, and said, "Fair warning, I'm terrible at anything before 1990. I said, "Lucky for you, pop culture after 1990 is basically my whole personality." He laughed. It was a real laugh. Not the kind men do when they're performing charm. The kind that happens when something actually catches them off guard. We won for what it's worth. After, when people were milling around with drinks, Maxwell found me by Claudette's bookshelf and asked what I did for work. I told him. He asked follow-up questions, not the usual, "Oh, so like you make apps?" Questions, but real ones. He wanted to know what the hardest part of the job was. He wanted to know if I found it lonely working alone. He wanted to know if I thought the UX field was going to change dramatically in the next 5 years, or if the fundamentals would stay steady. I talked for probably 20 minutes without realizing it. And at the end, he said, "I think I've been doing my own company's website a disservice. Can I give you my card?" He wasn't a client in the end. We went to dinner the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that, and the one after that too. And somewhere in there, the business card became irrelevant. I'll say this, Maxwell made the first year easy to love. There's no other way to put it. He worked as an operations director at Bridgestone Consulting Group, a corporate consulting firm with around 200 employees and a downtown office that looked exactly like you'd imagine. Glass and chrome and people in blazers typing very fast. He was good at his job and he knew it. But in those early months, he never made me feel like his job mattered more than mine. He asked about my projects with what seemed like genuine curiosity. He told his friends about my work like he was proud. He sat on my little leather couch in the garage once and watched me do a full usability audit of a client's checkout flow. And instead of getting bored after 10 minutes, he asked questions the whole way through. That afternoon in the garage, I remember, he had his legs stretched out on the couch and a can of sparkling water from my fridge balanced on his knee. And he watched me click through a client's website identifying points where users were dropping out of the checkout before completing a purchase. I was narrating out loud because that's how I think, talking through what the data was showing me, and he was genuinely following. At one point, he said, "Wait, so all those people are leaving right at the shipping estimate, not at the price?" And I said, "Exactly, the price is fine. The shipping estimate format is confusing. They don't know what they're paying until the last second, and it feels like a trick." He nodded slowly, and I could see him actually thinking about it, filing it somewhere. "That happens with pricing proposals at work," he said. "People get spooked by ambiguity, not by the actual number." It wasn't a profound observation, but it was a real one, made by someone who was actually in the conversation with me. I remember thinking, this is what it's supposed to feel like, this right here. Around month 8, his home office got repainted, and he asked if I'd design a series of digital illustrations for the walls. His city seen from different angles, different times of day, something cohesive he could get printed large format. I said yes immediately because it was a genuinely interesting project, and I spent 3 weeks getting it right. Different neighborhoods, different lights, a little moody, a little graphic. I did the arts district at twilight, the financial district at 5:30 in the morning when the light comes in low and horizontal, the river bend near the old mill at midday when everything flattens out and goes silver. When I delivered the finished files and he had them printed and hung, he texted me a photo and wrote, "People ask about these constantly. I tell everyone." That mattered to me, not because I needed his validation. I had clients who loved my work, and that was enough. But because it felt like evidence of something, like he actually saw me. We had rituals that felt sturdy. Saturday mornings at the diner on Aldrich Street, where Greta the waitress started bringing his coffee and my tea before we sat down, without asking, just because she knew. Sunday afternoon walks that always ended up at the bookstore on 5th, whether we planned it or not. There was something about that bookstore that acted like a magnet on both of us. The smell of the place, the narrow aisles, the chaotic organization that required actual searching instead of just going straight to a display. He came to openings at the design gallery near my studio and stood next to me while I talked to other designers, and he never once looked like he wished he was somewhere else, or at least not in those early months. I introduced him to Sylvia, who was not easy to win over and who gave him a full 30-day trial period before declaring him acceptable, possibly even decent. High praise from Sylvia. She texted me afterward. He made eye contact the whole time we talked. I actually checked to see if he was doing something else behind my back because nobody does that anymore. I met his friends, a group of guys from work who liked talking about the stock market and fantasy football, and who were perfectly pleasant in the generic way of people you meet in groups who are all performing a version of themselves they've agreed on collectively. I met his sister, Naomi, at Thanksgiving. She pulled me into the kitchen within 20 minutes and asked me quietly and without preamble, "Is he actually treating you well?" When I said yes, she looked at me for a moment and then said, "Okay, good." Like she'd been waiting to ask someone that for a while. I thought about that later. I probably should have thought about it more at the time. I built a whole belief system around that year. I decided it was real. I decided I'd found someone who respected what I did and who I was. I decided I'd been right to let myself trust it. I was wrong. But it took 14 months for the evidence to catch up with the belief. The first comment didn't register as a warning. I know that now. At the time, it just felt like a slightly irritating thing he said on an otherwise fine evening. We were at dinner at a new Italian place he'd wanted to try. White tablecloths, little votive candles, a wine list printed on heavy paper. I'd had a good week. Landed a new e-commerce client. Finished a complicated redesign project that I'd been wrestling with for 6 weeks. Gotten a genuinely glowing testimonial from a nonprofit I'd worked with for a year. I was in a good mood. I was talking. And somewhere in the middle of me describing the redesign project and how I'd solved a navigation problem that had been driving me insane, Maxwell set down his fork and said, "Have you ever thought seriously about going back in-house? Like actually thought it through?" I blinked. "I mean, not really. I like what I'm doing." "Sure, but the stability," he said, picking his fork back up. "Benefits, a real retirement account. You can't build long-term financial security on freelance income." "A lot of people do," I said, keeping my voice even. "Some do," he agreed, in a tone that suggested he found those people optimistic to the point of delusion. "But it's a lot of risk." I changed the subject. I told myself he was being practical. I told myself he came from a corporate background and that was just how he saw the world, and it didn't mean anything, but it didn't stop there. It never does. Over the next few months, the comments got more frequent and more specific. He started mentioning his coworkers the way people mention evidence. Derek just made senior analyst. That's the kind of trajectory that builds real wealth. Patricia just got her benefits package upgraded, and now she's got fully matched retirement contributions. You should hear what Bridgestone's senior team makes. And they weren't doing anything more impressive than what you're doing at 32. He stopped coming to gallery openings. Work obligations, he said, except those same evenings he was perfectly able to go to happy hour with colleagues. He stopped showing my work to people who came over. He stopped asking about my projects with any real interest. I'd tell him about something I was proud of, and he'd nod and say, "That's great," and steer the conversation back toward whatever was happening in his office. When his friends asked what I did, he started saying, "She's a freelancer, website stuff," in a tone that treated it like a hobby I happened to monetize. I noticed all of it. I just kept finding reasons not to take it seriously. Bridgestone's annual winter banquet was the second Friday of December. Maxwell had mentioned it twice in passing, but hadn't actually invited me until 4 days before, at which point he mentioned it the way you'd mention a dentist appointment. Something that needed to happen, not something to look forward to. The banquet was at the Carlisle downtown, which is a hotel with a ballroom that looks like someone's idea of what a ballroom should look like. Chandeliers, round tables with white linens, a bar at one end and a small stage at the other. There were maybe 150 people, most of them in dark suits or cocktail dresses. I wore a deep green dress I'd bought 2 years before and liked very much. I felt good walking in. The first hour was fine. Maxwell worked the room the way he always did at professional events, fluid, at ease, a different version of himself than the one I lived with, a little more polished, a little more deliberate. He introduced me to people, and I shook hands and made conversation, and it was all perfectly pleasant. I met a woman named Priscilla who was Maxwell's executive assistant and who had a dry sense of humor I immediately appreciated. I met a few people from his team. I met his colleague Derek, the one who'd gotten the senior analyst promotion, who was shorter than I'd imagined and who kept touching his tie. And then, around 9 o'clock, Maxwell was standing with 3 of his colleagues near the bar. A cluster of men in navy and charcoal, drinks in hand, doing that specific kind of corporate socializing that is basically just competitive storytelling. I came back from the restroom and joined the edge of the group. One of the men, I learned later his name was Gordon, said to Maxwell, "So, is this one serious?" Nodding in my direction, like I was a detail he needed to classify, and Maxwell laughed. He actually laughed. And then he said, "She's a freelancer, does website stuff. Honestly, she should feel lucky I bring her to these things." Nobody laughed. Gordon looked slightly uncomfortable. One of the others examined the bottom of his glass. I kept my face completely still. That was the strangest part. I didn't feel the urge to cry or to argue or to throw my drink. I felt something go very cold and very clear inside me, like a window had opened. I smiled. I said, "Excuse me," in a perfectly normal voice, and I went to get another glass of sparkling water. I stood at the bar for a moment and watched Maxwell pick right back up with the conversation, like nothing had happened, like he hadn't just told 3 people that my presence in his life was a charity he was extending. I stayed another 40 minutes. I said goodbye to Priscilla, who gave me a look I couldn't entirely read at the time. I let Maxwell drive me home. I did not say anything in the car. I went inside, made tea, and sat at my kitchen table until about 2 in the morning just thinking. That was the night. That was the moment where everything that came after got its start. By midnight, I wasn't angry anymore. Anger had passed through me like weather, fast and loud and then gone. What replaced it was something cleaner and more useful. I sat at my kitchen table with my mug of chamomile tea going cold beside me, and I thought about the last several months with a clarity I hadn't allowed myself before. I thought about it the way you go back through old files looking for something specific, methodically, without feeling sorry for what I found. The comments about my career starting around month 14, the way he'd pivoted from, "Your work is fascinating," to, "Have you considered something more stable?" without pausing to acknowledge the contradiction. The way I'd defended him to Sylvia twice, to myself probably 50 times. The way I'd translated his condescension into practicality because it was easier than the alternative. I thought about the illustrations hanging in his home office. I'd spent 3 weeks on those. I drove across town to look at the neighborhood I was trying to capture in the Riverbend piece because I wanted the light to be exact. I revised the financial district piece 4 times because something about the angle felt dishonest. I was proud of that work in a way that was separate from him, separate from what he thought about it, and he had used that work as proof of his taste to every person who visited his apartment. My labor as his decor. And then, "She should feel lucky I bring her to these things." Said easily, said casually, said the way you say something you've believed for a while and have never had any reason to examine. I thought, he is not a villain. He is something quieter and more corrosive than that. He is a man who genuinely believes some people are worth more than others, and that he is doing me a favor by including me. And that belief, held that quietly and that confidently, is not something I can argue with. It's not something I can fix. It is simply something I need to leave behind. I was done. Not done the way I'd been done before in other relationships, not the messy, tearful, need to process, this for 6 weeks kind of done. Just done, quietly and completely. The next morning, a Saturday, I waited until I knew he'd be awake. I called instead of texting because I'm not someone who ends things via text. He picked up on the 3rd ring, sounding relaxed. "Hey, I was thinking brunch," he said. "That new place on Henderson." "We should break up," I said. A pause. "What?" "Last night. What you said to those guys. She should feel lucky I bring her to these things. That's how you see me, and I'm not interested in being with someone who sees me that way." "That was a joke," he said, his voice shifting into something that was half defensive and half confused, like he was genuinely surprised this had landed wrong. "It wasn't funny," I said. "Take care, Maxwell." I hung up. He called back. I didn't answer. He texted twice. I read both messages and responded to neither. The first one said he wanted to talk. The second one said I was overreacting. I looked at both of them the way you look at an offer you've already declined and put my phone face down on the counter. Then I went into the garage, made coffee, and sat down at my desk. I had a project to finish. I finished it. Here's the thing about being angry without letting it make you stupid. You can actually do useful things with it. I gave myself a week of just being in my regular life. Working, yoga, dinner with Sylvia, who listened to the whole banquet story with the expression of someone who is extremely unsurprised and extremely angry on your behalf simultaneously. "He said that," she said, setting down her fork, out loud to multiple witnesses. "He did, in front of you." "Well, I came back right at the end. I don't think he saw me." "Which is almost worse," Sylvia said, "because it means he didn't even think twice." She was right, and it was that detail, the thoughtlessness of it, the confidence of it, that pointed me toward what I wanted to do next. I didn't want to scream at Maxwell or trash talk him to mutual friends or send him a long text about everything he'd done wrong. That felt like handing him the narrative, like making him the center of a story that was supposed to be about me. I wanted something else, something quieter and more permanent. I started by doing a little research on Bridgestone Consulting Group. This was all public information: their website, their LinkedIn page, their About Us section. The company had around 240 employees and had been founded about 15 years ago by a man named Gerald Hartley, who was now the regional director and one of the senior partners. Gerald had a professional LinkedIn profile and a clean headshot that made him look like someone who'd been quietly competent his whole life. Gerald had a son, Nolan Hartley, also on LinkedIn, though his profile was more casual. Profile picture taken outdoors, a documentary filmmaker with a small production company, 3 finished short docs that had played at regional festivals. He ran a workshop on documentary filmmaking through the Downtown Arts Center, meeting on Saturday mornings twice a month. The next session of that workshop was in 3 weeks. Registration was open. It cost $65 for the session. I registered before I'd consciously decided to. I filled out the form and hit submit and sat back in my chair and thought, okay, here we go. This is the part of the story I don't love telling, because it involves me being outsmarted, at least temporarily, by someone I had already decided to stop respecting. About 2 weeks after the breakup, I ran into a woman named Portia at the coffee shop near my studio. Portia and I had worked together 3 years back on a project for a local magazine. She was a copywriter, I'd done the web design, we'd gotten along well and stayed in loose touch the way you do with people you like but don't see regularly. We ended up sitting together for about half an hour, and at some point she mentioned she'd heard through the grapevine that Maxwell and I had split. "Yeah," I said, "it's for the best." "I'm sure it is," she said. "Though, and tell me if this is not my business, I heard he's been saying some things." I kept my face neutral. "What kind of things?" She looked uncomfortable, like she was debating whether to continue. "Apparently, he told a few people you were unstable, is the word I heard, and that he'd actually pre-filed something with HR at his company, some kind of documentation, before you could file anything." I felt a flicker of something cold. "Pre-filed what? I haven't filed anything." "I know," she said. "I think that's the point. He's getting ahead of it. So if anything comes back to him professionally, he already has a record of you being the problem." I drove home thinking about nothing else. This changed things. If Maxwell had already put something in an HR file at Bridgestone, any plan I had that involved showing up at company events could look like harassment. It could look like I was the one pursuing him, the one who couldn't let go, the one causing trouble. I spent the next 2 weeks trying to find out if this file existed. I called in a favor with a woman named Darlene, who did HR consulting for small firms and sometimes worked adjacent to bigger companies. She poked around through her network. I drafted a message to an employment law office asking hypothetically about the legality of preemptive HR filings. I spent a Sunday going through everything I knew about Bridgestone's HR department, trying to figure out if there was any way to verify what Portia had told me. And at the end of 2 weeks, Darlene called me back and said, "There's nothing. No filing, no documentation, no flag on your name. If he told people that, he was bluffing." I sat with that for a minute. Maxwell had planted a story. Or someone had planted it for him, or it had grown on its own in the rumor mill, and it had worked. It had cost me 2 weeks and one favor and a significant amount of anxiety. I'd changed my approach, gone defensive, spent energy on a threat that didn't exist. I made myself a note. Stop reacting. Start moving. The workshop was in 5 days. The Arts Center on Galveston Street was the kind of place that had been a warehouse in a previous life and still smelled faintly of it underneath the coffee and the dry erase markers. Workshop on documentary filmmaking. Techniques and storytelling was held in a large open room on the second floor with industrial windows and folding chairs arranged in a rough semicircle. About 14 people showed up, mostly in their 30s and 40s, a few retired-looking people who had the look of people finally doing the thing they'd always said they'd do someday. A woman my age with a notebook already open and color-coded tabs on the pages. A man who looked like he worked in finance and kept checking his watch in the first 10 minutes and then gradually stopped. Nolan Hartley was at the front setting up a laptop when I came in. He was tall, about my age, with the kind of relaxed physical ease that comes from being comfortable in your own body. He was wearing a faded olive canvas jacket over a gray t-shirt, and he had a small scar over his left eyebrow that I noticed later when I got closer. He looked like someone who spent time outdoors and thought about light the way I thought about negative space. The workshop started at 10 and ran until 1, and it was genuinely good. Nolan was the kind of teacher who talked less than you expected and asked questions more than you expected. He showed clips from 3 different documentaries and asked us to identify what the filmmaker was doing with pacing, with silence, with the placement of interviews. He talked about the difference between observational documentary and participatory documentary and what each approach asks of the subject. He had a way of sitting at the edge of a table while someone else was talking, hands loose, elbows on knees, that made it clear he was actually listening and not just waiting for his turn to talk again. I've met enough people who perform listening to know when I'm seeing the real thing. He showed a clip from a documentary about migrant farm workers, maybe 8 minutes long, during which he said almost nothing. When it ended, he let the silence sit for a moment before asking, "What did that cost you to watch?" Not what did you notice, not what did the filmmaker do well. What did it cost you? I thought about that question for a long time afterward. The idea that good documentary, like good UX, is measured partly by what it asks of the person on the receiving end. During the break, I got coffee from the table along the wall. The coffee was the kind that comes from a gas station pump, burnt and too hot and served in a styrofoam cup that felt faintly illegal in a building with this much exposed brick. Nolan was already there, pouring his own cup. I said the clips he'd chosen were an interesting contrast. Different approaches to the same basic problem of how to make someone's truth feel true to a stranger. He turned and looked at me with what seemed like genuine interest. Not the polite interest of someone making conversation, but the kind that sharpens slightly, like something just got a little more worth paying attention to. "That's exactly the tension," he said. "What do you do?" web development and UX design mostly. So you're solving the same problem. How do you make an interface tell someone exactly what they need without making them feel like they're being told? I had not expected that. That's a pretty good summary, actually. We talked for the entire 15-minute break. Not about his father, not about Bridgestone, about the work, about visual storytelling and the ethics of simplicity, and how both our fields required a deep faith that the audience was smarter than most people assumed. He said something about how the best documentary moments are the ones where nothing is explained, where the footage trusts the viewer to arrive at their own conclusion. And I said, that was exactly how good navigation design worked. You don't label everything, you create a path that feels inevitable. He said, yes, exactly that, and went quiet for a second, like he was filing something. When the workshop resumed, I caught myself thinking, I would have liked him regardless. That mattered. That fact would matter later. I went back to the next session of the workshop, and the one after that. By the third session, Nolan and I had started texting a few days before. He'd send a documentary clip he'd found interesting. I'd send back something about a design project that connected to it somehow. It was easy in the way that things are when you're talking to someone who processes the world the way you process it. The first time we got dinner, it wasn't technically planned. The workshop ran long one Saturday, and when it ended, he said he was going to get food somewhere nearby and did I want to come? And I said yes without thinking about it. We ended up at a Thai place on Fenwick that was small enough to feel accidental and good enough to feel lucky. We were there for 3 hours. He asked about my work the way that meant he was actually going to listen to the answer. He knew the names of UX principles I hadn't expected him to know. He pushed back on one thing I said about user testing methodology, and he was half right, which I told him, and he appreciated that I didn't just agree. He talked about his own work with the kind of honesty that's rare, the project that had gone wrong and why, the documentary subject who had pulled out 6 weeks in, the thing about the field that made him doubt himself at least twice a month. He didn't perform confidence. He just had it where he had it and was honest where he didn't. I want to be clear about something. I liked Nolan because of Nolan. The situation I'd put myself in, the strategy, all of that, it had gotten me into a room where I could meet him. But everything that came after that room was real. There is a difference, and it matters. We went on a second dinner, a third. He took me to a screening of a documentary he'd been following for 2 years about a retired postal worker in Mississippi who'd been quietly painting on the backs of old envelopes for 40 years. It was one of the best films I'd seen in years, and I cried at the end in a totally undignified way. And he handed me a napkin without comment, which felt like exactly the right response. By the time Bridgestone's spring gala appeared on the calendar, we'd been together for about 6 weeks. Around week 4 of Nolan and me, I found out what Maxwell had been doing with my work. It started with a call from a client named Harriet, who ran a mid-size online gift shop out of Portland. She'd been my client for about 18 months. I'd built her site, done 2 rounds of redesign, kept a good working relationship going. She called to ask, slightly awkwardly, whether I was still available or whether I'd gone to work for a consulting firm. A consulting firm, I said. Someone reached out to me, she said he consulted on my original site design, that he had ideas for the next phase. He seemed to know a lot about the project. I asked her to describe him. She described Maxwell. I had her forward me the initial email. He had written that he had worked closely with the development team on her current site and had significant input on the UX strategy during the design process. Both of these things were false. He had watched me work on that project for about 20 minutes one evening and asked 2 questions. He had 0 involvement in any decision. He was using the knowledge he'd absorbed from listening to me talk about my clients to poach them from me. I was furious, the quiet, cold kind. I went back through my email and found 2 other clients he'd contacted, a small branding agency in Chicago and a local restaurant group I'd done a full site build for. Same story each time. Same language about close involvement and significant input. 3 clients. He'd been systematically working his way through what he knew of my roster. I spent an evening screenshotting everything, his emails forwarded to me by the clients, the timestamps, the specific language he used that matched almost word-for-word things I'd said to him about my own projects. I saved them into a folder on my desktop. I opened my email and addressed it to myself as a backup and attached the files. The next morning, my laptop was frozen. Not slow, frozen. Black screen, no response. The kind of frozen that means something is actually wrong. I took it to the repair place on Morrison Street and was told the hard drive had failed. Data recovery was uncertain. They'd try. They found most things, not the folder, not the email drafts. I'd hit draft instead of send without realizing it, and the drafts hadn't synced before the crash. I sat in the parking lot of the repair shop and stared at the steering wheel for a while. Then I called Harriet. Here is what I had left. 3 clients who had received emails from Maxwell making false claims about his involvement in their projects. I no longer had the screenshots, but I had the clients themselves. I called each of them. I explained what had actually happened, that Maxwell had been my partner at the time. Certain projects were completed, but had no professional involvement, no creative input, no consulting role. I told them that the claims in his emails were false, and that I wanted them to know that directly, from me. I asked each of them if they would be willing to write a brief, factual statement about what they'd received. All 3 said yes. 2 of them were angry on my behalf. Harriet said, and I'm not paraphrasing much, I knew something felt off. No one who actually worked on a project talks about it the way he was talking about it. What I ended up with was better than screenshots. Screenshots can look edited. Screenshots can be questioned. 3 independent client statements, written in their own words, describing the same pattern. That was something that would be very hard to dismiss. I kept those statements. I put them somewhere safe. And I waited for the right moment to use them, which I did not yet know had already been set in motion. The LinkedIn message came on a Tuesday morning, 2 weeks before the gala. The sender was Priscilla, Maxwell's executive assistant, the woman with the dry humor I'd met briefly at the winter banquet, the one who had given me that look when I said goodbye. I stared at the message for a full minute before opening it. She introduced herself in case I didn't remember her. She said she wanted to reach out because she'd become aware of what Maxwell had been doing, specifically the emails to my former clients, and she was done staying quiet about it. I called her. She picked up immediately. I've been his EA for 3 years, she said. She had a calm, careful way of talking, like someone who had been waiting to say something for a long time and wanted to make sure she got it exactly right. I've watched him take credit for other people's work more times than I can count. I've watched him do it to junior analysts, to project managers, to his own team leads. I stayed quiet because it wasn't my fight. What changed? I asked. He started doing it to me, she said. Last month, he presented a project proposal to the leadership team that I had written entirely. He changed the title slide and presented it as his own work. I was in the room. He didn't even bother to look at me. There was a long pause. I have emails, she said. Internal ones. Him asking me to draft materials that he later presented as his. Him claiming credit for outcomes from projects I managed. A paper trail that would be difficult to explain away. Why are you bringing this to me? I asked. Because I heard through someone that you were seeing Gerald's son, she said, and I figured that meant you might end up at the spring gala, and I figured that if things were going to come apart for Maxwell, I'd rather help them come apart all the way than watch him land on his feet again. I asked her to send me what she had. She did that afternoon. 6 emails over 8 months. They were clear and specific and completely damning. I sat in my garage and looked at what I had. 3 client statements, 6 internal emails from Priscilla, and a dinner date with Nolan the Friday before the spring gala. Maxwell had decided I was a footnote. I had become a problem he hadn't prepared for. I picked out my dress on Thursday evening. I have a tendency to overthink clothes, so I made myself decide fast. A deep burgundy wrap dress I'd bought for a work trip to Chicago 2 years ago and worn exactly once. I knew it was right when I put it on and didn't feel the urge to second-guess it. Nolan called it around 9. He told his dad about me. Not everything, obviously, just the relevant parts. That we'd been seeing each other for a couple of months, that I was someone he liked, that she might find the event interesting, or she might find it extremely dull, and that was a fair response to a corporate consulting gala. Gerald had apparently said he was looking forward to meeting me. "You nervous?" Nolan asked. "No," I said. "Should I be nervous?" he asked, and I could hear the smile in it. "About what?" "I don't know. You sound very calm." "I am calm," I said. "I'm looking forward to it." After we hung up, I made a cup of tea and sat in the garage for a while, not working, just sitting. The project files on my second monitor glowed quietly. The lavender candle near the door had burned down to the last of its wax. I thought about Maxwell standing at the bar at the winter banquet. The ease of him, the confidence, the way he'd said she should feel lucky like it was obvious, like it required no defense, because the premise was beyond question. I slept fine. 8 hours. I woke up before my alarm. The Carlisle again. Same ballroom, different season. Lighter colors this time. Cream and pale gold instead of deep blue and white. Tall flower arrangements on every table. The bar stocked with the kind of wine that costs 3 times as much as it should at a corporate event. Nolan and I arrived at 7:15. He was wearing a dark suit with a burgundy pocket square that he'd chosen before seeing my dress, and that matched in a way that felt like a small private joke from the universe. He had his hand at the small of my back as we walked in, and he said something low and funny about the flower arrangements, and I laughed. Gerald Hartley found us within 10 minutes. He was a solid man, mid-60s, with a direct handshake and the kind of eyes that looked like they were always thinking 2 steps ahead. He shook my hand and said, "Nolan has told me quite a bit about you. The UX work sounds genuinely interesting. We've been overdue for a rethink of our client-facing platforms." I said I'd be happy to talk about that sometime and meant it. Gerald smiled and said, "I'd like that." And that was the moment Maxwell walked up. He was coming toward Gerald, presumably for small talk, and he saw me about 2 seconds before he was close enough to stop without it being obvious. His face did several things very quickly. First recognition, then calculation. Why is she? Then something that was trying to be neutral, but landed closer to a flinch. Gerald turned, saw Maxwell approaching, and said with the ease of a man who runs his own company, "Maxwell, you know Evelyn, I gather." "We've met," Maxwell said. His voice was exactly right, steady, professional. But his eyes went from me to Gerald to Nolan and back to me, and I could see the math happening. Gerald Hartley, Nolan, me. The silk thread connecting all 3 of us. The thing it meant. "She's dating your son," Gordon said from somewhere behind Maxwell, blundering into the moment with characteristic grace. "I am," I said pleasantly. Gerald put his hand on Nolan's shoulder with obvious warmth and said, "Good taste runs in the family, apparently." It was the kind of thing a man says when he means it as a compliment and is completely unaware it's also a twist of the knife. I watched Maxwell's jaw tighten exactly once. Then he excused himself to get a drink. I'd expected to let the evening be what it was. Let the moment land, have a nice time, go home. That was the plan. Maxwell had other ideas. About an hour in, I stepped away from a conversation with 2 of Gerald's colleagues to get a glass of water. The bar was quieter at that end. The dinner service had started, and most people had drifted toward their tables, so it was just the bartender and a few stragglers. I was standing there waiting when Maxwell appeared next to me. He didn't approach head-on. He came from the side and positioned himself at the bar like he was also just getting a drink, like this was incidental. like he'd just happened to end up here. That pretense lasted about 10 seconds. "Nice dress," he said. His voice was light, but his posture wasn't. His jaw was set and his shoulders were doing that thing they did when he was trying to look relaxed while being the opposite. "Thank you," I said. "This is interesting," he said. "The timing, I mean, you and Nolan." "Is it?" "You know it is." His voice dropped slightly. "How long have you been planning this?" "Planning what?" I asked, with what I hoped was appropriate bewilderment. "This." He gestured vaguely at the room, at me, at Nolan across the room talking to someone. "Showing up here. Being here." "I'm here because my boyfriend invited me to his father's company event," I said. "The same way you invited me to this same event 6 months ago. Funny how that works." His jaw did the tightening thing again. "You approached him deliberately. You found out who he was and—" "Maxwell," I said, and I kept my voice very steady. "I met Nolan at an art workshop. We have a lot in common professionally. We're together because we like each other. That's the whole story." "You expect me to believe that?" "I expect you to handle this like a professional," I said, "because we are at your employer's event and there are several people in earshot." I was right about the earshot. His colleague Derek was 3 feet away, pretending to study the wine list with enormous concentration. And Priscilla was standing near the end of the bar, not pretending to do anything else, just watching. Maxwell took a breath and said something that I won't repeat exactly because he'd clearly had 1 glass of wine too many and was not making strategic choices anymore. It was the kind of comment that was too loud and too bitter and too specific about my supposed motives to sound like anything other than a man who felt ambushed and was handling it by throwing a lit match. He said something about me being the kind of person who always needed an angle, about how he should have known, about how this had Sylvia's fingerprints all over it, which was such a strange thing to say about someone he'd met 4 times that it almost made me laugh. Derek looked up from the wine list. Priscilla turned and walked calmly toward Gerald Hartley. Maxwell seemed to realize in real time what he'd just done. His face changed. He looked at Derek, at Priscilla's retreating back, at the 3 other people who had unavoidably heard the last part of what he'd said. "Excuse me," he said stiffly, and walked away. I stood there for a moment, then took my water and went to find Nolan. The reports went in the following Monday. Derek filed one. He'd heard Maxwell's comments at the bar and, as he told HR, they had made him deeply uncomfortable and had also prompted him to think back on other incidents, including the winter banquet, which several people had apparently discussed quietly since it happened, but nobody had formally reported. Priscilla filed one. Hers was comprehensive. She included her account of the gala, a summary of the pattern she'd observed over 3 years, and she attached the internal email records she'd described to me. 6 emails, a paper trail that was, as she'd said, difficult to explain away. I was not asked to file anything, but 2 days later I received an email from someone in Bridgestone's HR department asking if I would be willing to provide any information relevant to an ongoing internal matter. I sent them the 3 client statements. I explained, factually and briefly, what had happened with Maxwell's outreach to my clients and what it had contained. I heard about what happened next through Nolan, who heard it from Gerald, who didn't editorialize much but stated facts. Maxwell was placed on a formal performance review. The client impersonation issue, which is what it was, legally speaking, was particularly serious because it implicated Bridgestone by association. The HR report from Derek added weight to a pattern that had apparently been documented informally more than once. Maxwell resigned 6 weeks later. From what I understood, he negotiated the exit quietly, which was probably the smartest thing he'd done in months. I heard the news on a Thursday afternoon. I was in the middle of a call with a new client, a sustainable goods company that had reached out through a referral, and Nolan texted me. I saw the message after the call ended and I sat with it for a minute. I thought I would feel more than I did. satisfaction maybe, or vindication, or some specific kind of triumph, what I felt was mostly just done. Like a task that had been sitting on my list had finally been crossed off. Important, but not dramatic. I texted Nolan back, "Okay, you still want to do dinner Thursday?" He wrote back, "Already made the reservation." 3 months after Maxwell handed in his resignation, I ran into Derek at the coffee shop on Aldrich Street. It was a Tuesday morning in early April, cool and bright outside, the kind of day where the winter finally feels like it's actually over. I was waiting for my order at the end of the counter when I heard someone say my name. I turned, and there he was, shorter than memory, holding a paper cup, looking like a man bracing for something. "Evelyn," he said again, with the energy of someone who has been rehearsing this conversation in their head. "Derek," I said. He shifted his weight. "I've been thinking about that night a while back, at the banquet, the first one in December. What Maxwell said about you being lucky he brought you." He paused. I laughed. I shouldn't have. I've been thinking about that. I looked at him. He wasn't performing the apology. He was actually uncomfortable, actually contrite, actually saying a thing he felt needed saying even though it was awkward and nothing obligated him to do it. "I appreciate you saying that," I said, and I meant it. "It means something." He nodded, relieved. "I heard he's at another firm now, smaller one. Seems like He stopped. "Sorry, you probably don't care." "Not really," I said honestly. He actually smiled a little at that. "Fair enough." My order came up. I took it, said goodbye, and walked out into the April morning. Nolan and I had signed a lease on a shared studio space 3 weeks earlier. A proper workspace. Not my garage and not his spare room, but an actual place that we'd split down the middle with a low bookshelf, his editing station on one side and my development setup on the other. High ceilings. Good light. A coffee maker that was substantially better than my Keurig. It was quiet in there in the mornings, in the way that's only possible when two people have gotten comfortable with silence together. He'd be working on his footage and I'd be deep in a project and we'd go an hour without saying anything, and it didn't feel like distance. It felt like the opposite. My client roster had grown. 2 new e-commerce clients. A referral from Harriet that turned into a 6-month contract, a nonprofit I'd wanted to work with for 2 years that finally had budget. Good work. Work I believed in. I thought about what Maxwell had said that night. She should feel lucky. And I realized I was lucky. Genuinely. But not in any way he had in mind. I was lucky because I'd recognized the moment for what it was. I was lucky because I hadn't let it make me small or bitter or reactive in ways that would have cost me more than he was worth. I was lucky because I'd met a man who looked at my work and saw exactly what it was and then treated me accordingly. Maxwell hadn't destroyed himself because I'd planned it. He destroyed himself because he was the kind of person who treats other people like decorations, like proof of something, like evidence in an argument he's making about himself. And eventually, those people stopped playing along. I'd just been the first one to stop. Others had followed. The revenge, if you want to call it that, hadn't been the gala. It hadn't been his resignation. It had been this. The Tuesday morning coffee, the April light, the studio I shared with someone who respected me, the inbox full of work I'd chosen for myself. I walked back toward the studio. My coffee was exactly the right temperature. The city smelled like it always does in early spring. Wet pavement and something vaguely green trying to come through. I had a 9 o'clock call I was ready for. That was enough. That was actually more than enough. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and consider subscribing. You can also drop any comment below, even just one word. Maybe tell me where you're watching from, or what time it is right now. Sometimes one word is enough to say you were here.